The Troubles is the common name for the ethno-nationalist conflict in Northern Ireland that spilled over at various times into parts of the Republic of Ireland, England and mainland Europe. The conflict began in the late 1960s and is deemed by many to have ended with the Belfast Good Friday Agreement of 1998. Although there has been sporadic violence since then. Internationally, it is also commonly called a Northern Ireland conflict and has been described as a war. The conflict was primarily political with strong ethnic and sectarian dimensions, although it was never about religious belief. A key issue was the constitutional status of Northern Ireland. Nationalists, Republicans, who are mostly Roman Catholics and view themselves as Irish, generally want it to leave the United Kingdom and join a united Ireland. Another key issue was the relationship between these two communities. The conflict began amid a campaign to end discrimination against the Catholic, nationalist minority by the Protestant, Unionist-dominated government and police force. The main participants in the Troubles were Irish Republican paramilitaries such as the Provisional Irish Republican Army and the Irish National Liberation Army, Ulster Loyalist paramilitaries such as the Ulster Volunteer Force and Ulster Defence Association, British State Security Forces, the British Army, and the Royal Ulster Constabulary, and political activists and politicians. The security forces of the Republic of Ireland played a smaller role. More than 3,500 people were killed in the conflict. Overview. The Troubles refers to the most recent installment of violence over 3 decades between nationalists and unionists. The term, the Troubles, was previously used to refer to the Irish Revolutionary period. It was adopted to refer to the escalating violence in Northern Ireland after 1969. The conflict was the result of discrimination against the nationalist, Catholic minority by the Unionist, Protestant majority and the question of Northern Ireland's status within the United Kingdom. The violence was characterised by the armed campaigns of Irish Republican and Ulster Loyalist paramilitary groups and British State Security Forces, the British Army and the Royal Ulster Constabulary. It thus became the focus for the longest major campaign in the history of the British Army. The British government's position is that its forces were neutral in the conflict, trying to uphold law and order in Northern Ireland and the right of the people of Northern Ireland to democratic self-determination. Nationalists regard the state forces as forces of occupation or partisan combatants in the conflict. The Ballast investigation by the police ombudsman confirmed that British forces did on several occasions collude with loyalist paramilitaries, were involved in murder, and furthermore obstructed the course of justice when claims of collusion and murder were investigated. The Troubles were brought to an uneasy end by a peace process that included the declaration of ceasefires by most paramilitary organizations, the complete decommissioning of the IRA's weapons, the reform of the police, and the corresponding withdrawal of the British Army from the streets and sensitive Irish border areas such as South Armagh and Fermanagh, as agreed by the signatories to the Belfast Agreement. One part of the agreement is that Northern Ireland would remain within the United Kingdom unless a majority of the Northern Irish electorate vote otherwise. Although the number of active participants was relatively small, the Troubles touched the lives of many in Northern Ireland on a daily basis, sometimes spreading into England, the Republic of Ireland, and, occasionally, parts of mainland Europe. Background: 1609 to 1791. In 1609, Scottish and English settlers, known as planters, were given land confiscated from the native Irish in the plantation of Ulster, coupled with Protestant immigration to unplanted areas of Ulster, particularly Antrim and Down. This resulted in conflict between the native Catholics and their planters, leading in turn to 2 bloody ethno-religious conflicts known as the Irish Confederate Wars and the Williamite War, both of which resulted in Protestant victories. Anglican dominance in Ireland was ensured by the passage of the penal laws that curtailed the religious, legal, and political rights of anyone who did not conform to the state church, the Anglican Church of Ireland. As the penal laws started to be phased out in the latter part of the 18th century, there was more competition for land, as restrictions were lifted on the Irish Catholic ability to rent, with Roman Catholics allowed to buy land and enter trades from which they had formerly been banned. Tensions arose, resulting in the Protestant Pipo des Bois and Catholic defenders. This created polarization between the communities and a dramatic reduction in reformers among Protestants, many of whom had been growing more receptive to democratic reform. 1791 to 1912, following the foundation of the Irish Republican Society of the United Irishmen by Presbyterians, Catholics, and liberal Anglicans, and the resulting failed Irish Rebellion of 1798, sectarian violence between Catholics and Protestants continued. The Orange Order, with its stated goal of upholding the Protestant faith and loyalty to the heirs of William of Orange, dates from this period and remains active to this day. With the 1801 Act of Union, a new political framework was formed with the abolition of the Irish Parliament and incorporation of Ireland into the United Kingdom. The result was a closer tie between Anglicans and the formerly Republican Presbyterians as part of a loyal Protestant community. Although Catholic emancipation was achieved in 1829, largely eliminating official discrimination against Roman Catholics, dissenters, and Jews, Daniel O'Connell's long-term goals of repeal of the 1801 Union and the granting of Home Rule were never achieved. The Home Rule movement served to define the divide between most nationalists, who sought the restoration of an Irish Parliament, and most Unionists, who were afraid of being a minority under a Catholic-dominated Irish Parliament and tended to support continuing union with Britain. Unionists and Home Rule advocates were the main political factions in 19th and early 20th century Ireland. 1912 to 1922. By the second decade of the 20th century, Home Rule, or limited Irish self-government, was on the brink of being conceded due to the agitation of the Irish Parliamentary Party. In response, Unionists, mostly Protestant and concentrated in Ulster, resisted both self-government and independence for Ireland, fearing for their future in an overwhelmingly Catholic country dominated by the Roman Catholic Church. In 1912, Unionists led by Edward Carson signed the Ulster Covenant and pledged to resist Home Rule by force if necessary. To this end, they formed the paramilitary Ulster Volunteers. In response, nationalists led by Owen MacNeill formed the Irish Volunteers, whose goal was to oppose the UVF and ensure enactment of the Third Home Rule Bill in the event of British or Unionist recalcitrance. The outbreak of the First World War in 1914 and Ireland's involvement in the war temporarily averted possible civil war in Ireland and delayed the resolution of the question of Irish independence. Home Rule, although passed in the British Parliament with royal assent, was suspended for the duration of the war. The Irish Volunteers split, with a majority, called National Volunteers, joining Irish regiments of the new British Army. Many of those who stayed were radical nationalists, among them Irish Republican Brotherhood infiltrators. From these ranks came those who launched the Easter Rising in Dublin in 1916, led by Patrick Pearse and James Connolly. 2.5 years after the executions of 15 of the Rising's leaders, the separatist Sinn Féin party won the December 1918 Irish general election with a majority of seats in Ireland, and set up the 1919 First Dáil in Dublin. Their victory was aided by the threat of conscription for World War I service. The Irish War for Independence followed, leading to eventual independence in 1922 for the Irish Free State, which comprised 26 of the 32 Irish counties. The Government of Ireland Act 1920 partitioned the island of Ireland into two separate jurisdictions, Southern Ireland and Northern Ireland, both devolved regions of the United Kingdom. This partition of Ireland was confirmed when the Parliament of Northern Ireland exercised its right in December 1922 under the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921 to opt out of the newly established Irish Free State. A part of the treaty signed in 1922 mandated that a boundary commission would sit to decide where the frontier of the northern state would be in relation to its southern neighbour. After the Irish Civil War of 1922–23, this part of the treaty was given less priority by the new Dublin government led by W.T. Cosgrave, and was quietly dropped. As counties Fermanagh and Tyrone and border areas of Londonderry, Armagh, and Down were mainly nationalist, the Irish Boundary Commission could reduce Northern Ireland to 4 counties or less. Northern Ireland remained a part of the United Kingdom, albeit under a separate system of government whereby it was given its own parliament and devolved government. While this arrangement met the desires of Unionists to remain part of the United Kingdom, nationalists largely viewed the partition of Ireland as an illegal and arbitrary division of the island against the will of the majority of its people. They argued that partition was neither legitimate nor democratic, but designed to create a deliberately gerrymandered Unionist majority. Catholics initially composed about 35% of its population. A total of 557 people were killed in political or sectarian violence from 1920 to 1922 in the 6 Northern Ireland counties, during and after the Irish War of Independence, most of whom were Catholics. The result was communal strife between Catholics and Protestants, with nationalists characterizing this violence, especially that in Belfast, as a pogrom against their community. Although historian Peter Hart argues that the term is not appropriate given the reciprocity of violence in Northern Ireland. 1922 to 1966, a legacy of the Irish Civil War, later to have a major impact on Northern Ireland, was the survival of a marginalised remnant of the Irish Republican Army. It was proscribed on both sides of the border and remained ideologically committed to overthrowing both polities by force of arms to unify Ireland. The Northern Irish government passed the Civil Authorities Act 1922. This gave sweeping powers to the government and police to do virtually anything seen as necessary to re-establish or preserve law and order. The act continued to be used against nationalists long after the violence of this period had come to an end. The two sides' positions became strictly defined following this period. From a Unionist perspective, Northern Ireland's nationalists were inherently disloyal and determined to force Unionists into a united Ireland. This threat was seen as justifying preferential treatment of Unionists in housing, employment and other fields. The prevalence of large families and a more rapid population growth among Catholics were seen as threats, even though this was offset by a higher emigration rate for Catholics until the 1950s. The Republic of Ireland's Taoiseach, Charles Haughey, whose own family had fled County Londonderry during the 1920s Troubles, described Northern Ireland as a failed political entity. The Unionist government ignored Edward Carson's warning in 1921 that alienating Catholics would make Northern Ireland inherently unstable. After the early 1920s, there were occasional incidents of sectarian unrest in Northern Ireland. These included severe rioting in Belfast in the 1930s and 1950s, the brief Northern Campaign in the 1940s, and the Border Campaign between 1956 and 1962, which did not enjoy broad popular support among nationalists. In 1962, the IRA called off its campaign. Northern Ireland became relatively stable for a brief period.